All right, well, thanks everyone for joining today. Looks like we got a pretty big crowd that's continuing to join us. Probably a pretty interesting topic to many of you. It looks like based especially on the poll results that many of you have yet to set up this kind of security model. So maybe there's a lot of interest in how to do so. And hopefully you came to the right place. We're going to look at a lot of different examples of different ways that you can set up security in Power BI. And we're looking specifically at more data level security. So I tried to make that evident from the description. So we're going to be focused solely on how do I secure the data within inside of my model. So let's get into it a bit here. My name is Devin Knight. If you're not too familiar with myself, I'm the president of training at Pragmatic Works. That just means that I focus on all the things that have to do with training within inside of our organization. So we build different training courses like Azure and Power BI courses, and we offer those to our customers. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, so I evangelize a lot of the Microsoft products, and they've recognized me for that. And I've also authored 7 books related to the data platform in some way. So whether it be a Power BI book, which is my most recent, or a more SQL Server focused in BI related books in the past. I also participate in a local group out of Jacksonville, Florida. I just tell you that because it tells you where I'm from. I'm from Jacksonville in Florida, and I love spending my time here with my family. I also blog at a website called devinknightsql.com, so you can find a lot of what I write about there. And there's a lot of stuff that I do related to BI, Power BI specifically. So I've done quite a few blogs on video-based blogs on interview questions that you should kind of prepare yourself for if you're going to look for a Power BI job, or maybe perhaps you're actually interviewing for Power BI potential candidates. And I also blog quite a bit on videos about what's the latest updates that have come out with Power BI. All right, you can also find my contact information on the bottom left there with my Twitter and email address. Okay, so real focus, what are we focused on today? We're going to talk, of course, about what is row level security. So if you haven't really played around with it too much, we want to give you a little bit of context of what it is. We're also then going to walk you through setting up some basic row level security models, and then we're going to make it dynamic. So how do we then make this scalable when I have hundreds, if not thousands of users that I need to give access to? What are some of the elements that I need to think about, and how do I need to set up my model to be able to potentially handle thousands of users? All right, so let's jump right into it. So what is row level security? What does it do? Basically what it's going to do for you here is it gives you the ability to restrict rows within inside of your data model to be viewed specifically by individuals that you set. Okay, so if you have, let's say for example, you work within a sales region or a sales data set that you're working with, and you want to make sure that only those sales managers can see the data that's specific to them, then you can set up within inside of your data model the ability to restrict the rows to only allow them to see the rows that are specific to them. So you can actually set that up within inside of your model and make it so that they're only seeing the rows that they're allowed to see or that you want them to see. So what is row level security not? It is not things like sharing reports or dashboards or workspaces or even creating Power BI apps for sharing. So this is not about content sharing. So just want to make sure to differentiate the difference here. This is all around how do I make sure that my data level security is set up, and it's not anything related to how do I share a report or a dashboard or a workspace or an app. So a little bit different. One's content sharing, which is not what we're focused on, and what we are focused on, of course, is data sharing. Okay, so how do we set up row level security? Really, regardless of how complex or simple your example is, it's really a two-step process. The first step is in the Power BI desktop, where you're going to create a role. And the role that you're going to create is going to define how the rows within inside of your model should be restricted. Okay, so that's all done for within inside the Power BI desktop. That's the only place you can do that as of today. Not that I know of any changes coming with that, but as of today, the only place you can change security at a row level is going to be inside the Power BI desktop. And then when you actually, your next step after you define what the role is allowed to see, then you deploy that Power BI model to the Power BI service, and you assign users or ideally groups to that role. And this is where you actually assign what individuals, again, or preferably groups, are allowed to see the data that you've set up within those roles. Okay, so two-step process. Once in the Power BI desktop, and then second inside the Power BI service where you're actually going to assign users to that role. So for a basic row level security, it's pretty simple. You for from taking this from a basic standpoint, you can hard code what you want to secure. Is a very basic example of how you can do that. And it looks like I have a little typo here. Let me fix that. The second bullet there's a little off. Oop. Sorry, guys. Go to the right slide here. I noticed a little typo in it. Just want to fix that. So the configuration is pretty simple. You would actually go into your Power BI desktop and you would tell it how do you want to specifically secure your data. So which rows do you want to filter to only be seen by a particular role? The downside of this basic security setup that I'm going to show you is it's not dynamic. So if you had potentially hundreds or even thousands of users that you needed to have security roles set up for, the basic security method that I'm going to show you here in just a moment to get the wheels turning here a little bit is not ideal. It's great for very simple setups where maybe you have a handful of different situations where people need to have their data secured. But if you're looking at really potentially hundreds or even thousands of ways that people need the data secured, then there's a better method that I'm going to show you in a bit. All right, so let's show you what a basic security role setup would look like for row level security. So I have a model that I already have ready to go right here. And just to give you a little context with the data, this data model has in it Medicare spending data. So we're looking at Medicare spending data and how it relates to the individual hospitals. And so what I'd like to do is I want to be able to secure this model to only show certain counties of data. Counties meaning we're talking with inside of the United States, a geographical region called a county. And I want to be able to only restrict rows to one or maybe two particular counties within a role. So if I wanted to do that, I would actually set up a role by going underneath the modeling ribbon. So you'll find there's a modeling ribbon up at the top of the Power BI desktop, which you've likely used before. And one section of it here is devoted to security. And there's a section here where you can either manage a role or you can view a role and test out any security models that you might have defined. In our case here, we're going to manage a role. So I'm going to select manage role here. And when we do that, it gives us the ability to create a brand new role. And actually, normally it looks like this, where it's kind of empty and you're going to create one from scratch. So you would normally come in here and you would select that you want to create a new role and give the role some kind of a name. So we could call this really whatever you want. The nice thing is your users never see whatever the role name is that you provide. So maybe I tell it that I want to create a role that just secures to the county surrounding my location, which is Jacksonville. And Jacksonville has a county called Duval County that surrounds it. So I can create a role and name it whatever I want. Again, your users are not going to see the role names. Then, once you've created the role, you're going to define what the role is not or is only allowed to see, I should say. So basically what you're going to do with inside of the table section is you're going to select a column within inside of the tables and tell it which one of the columns you want to filter down. And so what's going to happen is we're going to define how we want to filter down this model based on the county in this case, and then we'll start to assign users to this role when we deploy the Power BI service, and those users that are part of this role will only be able to see data that's related to this county. Now, one of the things that becomes really important when it comes to Power BI security is relationships. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through some of our more complex examples. But the relationships that you have between your tables, which in this case I have two tables here, is going to be critically important to make sure that the security that you set up on, in this case, the hospital table, feeds its way into the Medicare spending table. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add in a filter to be based off of the county state. And so when I select that, you can see a little filter icon appears here indicating that I have some kind of a filter applied on the hospital table. And by the way, you can have multiple filters here. If I wanted to, I could add another one and say that I want this one to be based on state if I wanted to. So you can kind of choose if you want one or many filters applied within each of the roles that you set up. In this case, I just want to have one filter applied on the county state field, and I want it to be filtered to Duval County. And Duval is Duval, Florida inside my data set, so it looks like that. And it is important that you make sure that you type in whatever the data value is that you're trying to filter on exactly as it appears in your data model, because, of course, spelling does count because it's looking for a particular value in here. And if you type in a value that doesn't exist in your model, then your role of security is not going to work as you would think it would. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit save on this, and when I do, it's going to save that into my data model. And the nice thing is you can simply test that and verify that it's going to do what you think it's going to do by going back up to the security section here and selecting View as Role. So if I select View as Role, this allows me to actually test out that Duval County role that we just created a moment ago and verify that it's going to filter down the data as I think it should. So if I select Duval County and hit OK, you'll notice that it now selects and only displays data within inside of that one county, that's Duval County, Florida. And I can see the hospitals that are specific to that region. I can see the claim type spending by that region. And you can see in the top left where I had a slicer, it's only showing the one county that I have that's available to me. Okay. Now up in the top here, you can see that it's telling me that it's now viewing this data set as Duval County role. This is just indicating here that you're testing it as this security role that you created. Anytime you hit the stop viewing, it'll just revert back to what it was like before. So if you hit stop, it'll revert back, and we should see all the results come back after a moment or two. Now you can, of course, make modifications to that role if you wanted to. You can go back into the Manage Role section here, and I could add multiple counties to this if I wanted to. So I could, if I wanted to, actually add in a second county here and say, well, let's actually filter by both Duval County and a neighboring county, which is one called Clay County. Okay, and then hit save. And now if I were to test out the role again, it would filter to the two particular counties that I happen to select that are neighboring counties. So after I give this a moment or two, we should see it zoom in and only focus in on the one area that I did. And actually one issue that I have in this case is I should have done an OR. So what I did by default is it said that I wanted to filter to Duval County and Clay County. Well, I don't have any rows that are both of those values. And so it actually caused a little bit of an issue here because I did an AND operator there instead of an OR operator. To fix that, it's pretty simple to do. I would go back up to manage, I would go back up to manage roles here. And underneath here, this is my AND operator, and I could flip this from saying AND to OR just by simply doing double pipes. That's an OR operator here in DAX. You're writing little DAX expressions here to be able to set up your security model. And here using an OR operator, that should function as we would anticipate here. There we go. So now, again, viewing it as the Duval County role, I can see both the Duval County and Clay County now appear, and it did add at least one extra hospital to my chart on the bottom. Okay. All right, good deal. I do see a question in here. Is it possible to set up column level security? You can do that in tabular models. Tabular models are kind of like the enterprise version of the Power BI data model. It's not quite as simple to do that with inside of the Power BI data model. So let me explain the answer to that question a bit. When you go to the Manage Roles section, so the question is there a way where I could basically make it so that someone could not see an entire column? And it's not that simple, unfortunately. If you wanted to do something like that, I would definitely suggest looking at tabular models where that is possible. What you can do with inside of your Power BI data model is you could hide an entire table. So they have an option here where you can tell it that you want to hide all rows, and what it does whenever you select that option, let me zoom in on that so make sure you see that. If I tell it that I want to add a filter to hide all rows, then it would actually hide the entire table. So it would make it so that no one could get to anything within inside the table. It's a great question because you may have circumstances where there's payroll information in one column that you don't necessarily want to be available in others. So what you could do is you could set up where you could hide, in this case, an entire table. And all it does whenever you select that is it replaces the table filter here to just say false, which means that that table should not be available to any users that are part of this role. So what you might do is you put more specific information within inside of a table. You might be more granular with your table design. Now, when it comes to tabular models, if any of you are working through tabular models right now, tabular models do allow for specific column level security. And essentially what it would be is you would actually say, rather than just saying false at the entire table level, you do have the option where you can tell it at a column level that you want it to return back this column as false. And if you do that, this does not work in Power BI, by the way. So what I'm trying to do right now, it's actually not going to work once I actually go into it here. You'll notice that everything in my report kind of fades out here because that's something that you can do in tabular models, but it's not quite there in Power BI currently. So just keep that in mind. Column level security is not, individual columns is not a security model that's set up with inside Power BI. You can do entire tables though. Okay, so let's say that we've created our role that we had a moment ago. Let's add the one that we had just a few moments ago back in here. And let's go back in, and I'm going to put Duval County back in. And let's say that we had more than one security role set up. So, for example, right now I have one set up for Duval County that's a lower level than a state, but I want to add in one here for a state as well. So I can add in multiple roles here, and I can have my second one that I'm going to design to be a Florida state role. Okay? And if I'm going to do it at the state level, then I'm likely going to have this role set up so that it filters on the state column. So I can actually go into Add Column, select State, and then I can tell it that I want to filter this down to just the state of Florida. So I can type in Florida here. Now when I do that and hit Save, it's going to provide two roles that are available to my users, and they can choose from the different roles that are inside of my model if they go back over to the View as Roles option. And you can test both of these roles at the same time if you wanted to, but you should note that one of the roles obviously is at a higher granularity. My one that is set up as at the state level is going to take precedence over my Duval County one. So if you have a user that's assigned to multiple roles, which you can do, then it's going to make it so that you only see the one that has the higher granularity. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. All right, cool. So this is kind of a simple example. The last step that we would do on this simple example is I would take what we have here and actually deploy this to the Power BI service. So I would take this, I would publish this to the Power BI service. You'll find that underneath the Home ribbon, and you'll select Publish right here. And I have some folks asking if I'm going to show dynamic security. Absolutely. I want to make sure I get the basics first because there's a lot of people that haven't done this before. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this off to the Power BI service. And I have a workspace that I've created specifically for this called Security Webinar. All right, so I'm going to publish this off to the Power BI service. And the reason I'm doing this is the last step to make sure that I can actually assign users to that role. So once that completes, and it's done now, I should be able to go over to the Power BI service and actually start to look at the data set that we deployed. So I have a few other ones that I've already deployed in here. I'm actually going to delete those because we're going to redeploy them out a bit later. But the one there called Basic Security Example number 1, we're going to look at this one first. And what I'd like to do with this is we're going to actually set up and assign users to that data set by simply selecting on the workspace. There's an option here where we can choose that we want to apply security, and that's basically mapping users to that role. If you go underneath the More Options section here, you'll see there's a section here for security. And if I select that, this will show the two roles that we've created earlier, and then I can assign users, or again, like I mentioned earlier, ideally groups to that role. So if I wanted to assign a group I have called trainers, I could assign my trainers group to that role and select Add and Save. And now anyone that's part of my group called trainers is now going to have access to the data that's part of the Duval County role. Inside the Power BI service, you can also test the security here as well. If you click the little ellipses here and hit Test as Role, this allows you to actually test inside the Power BI service as the Duval County role, or it allows you to actually set up a specific user that you want to test as. So for example, if I wanted to, I could test as somebody that's inside of that role, which would be maybe Manuel. I could try as him. And if I select and type in his name, it's going to show me what he is allowed to see here. Okay, so you have kind of the ability, a nice ability within there to actually be able to not only assign users, but then be able to test as that user to verify that they can see what you think they're supposed to see. Okay. All right, so I had a question here is where are the groups defined? So this is actually tapping into my Azure Active Directory. So you could either just simply type in specific email addresses for users, or if you have Azure Active Directory configured here, you can easily be able to tap into those groups that's already been assigned here. Okay. All right, great. So here's what we're going to do next. Our next step then is to start talking about dynamic security. One thing I realized as I was doing this is I have a few things here left over from just planning out the webinar. So I'm going to delete a few of these items before we go on to our next example where we start to talk about more dynamic security. And we'll flip back over to the slides now. Okay. All right, so the problem with the row level security is it doesn't really deal with the issues of scalability. So where I have potentially hundreds or thousands of different security setups that I might need to consider, it doesn't take into account those different scenarios. And so what you could end up with is, you can see the screenshot over here, is a bunch of different security roles created for all these different scenarios. And so the better option for continuing maintenance or for continuing to be able to manage this security model is to set up more of a dynamic security model. Okay, so how does this work? So with dynamic security, it's going to actually, within Power BI, capture the login of the user that's signed in to cross-check their account, their email account, across your data model. So you would actually need to have within inside of your data model the email address of the user that you want to verify what rows they're allowed to see. And so it's going to check the permissions against the table that you have in the data model and match the user's login to what rows are acceptable for them to be able to see. It does require a little bit of DAX to do this. There is two functions that you could use. The one that's primarily recommended is this one here called user principal name. So you'll see there's two functions that you could choose from, username and user principal name. Go with the user principal name. There are a few things where the username was the function that came out first, but user principal name was kind of improved upon, where it actually works in many more scenarios than username will, and it's better for debugging as well. So we're going to walk you through how you can actually set up a model that uses and follows this more dynamic setup here. All right, so let's actually walk through a different example here in this case. I'm going to close out this one that we started off with and open up a second example here. And this one's still going to be kind of a basic example because I want to work our way up to a more complex one. But as I open the second example, we're going to actually reference a table that I have, still looking at the Medicare spending data, but I'm going to have in this scenario attached to each hospital a doctor's email address that I'm going to allow to view the certain rows that I have inside my data set. So just to kind of give you a little peek at what this looks like, if we go to our data view here, within inside of our data view, I have a column called doctor email and doctor name. And the rows that are within inside of my hospital table have the doctor that should be allowed to see information about this hospital. Now, this is a very basic example. We're going to show a more complex example where you could have multiple doctors assigned to one hospital. So we're going to get to that. But for this basic setup, I need to have something in here that ties into their email account. And this is the same account that's going to be tapped into within Power BI. Okay. So if I want to set up a model here that uses and leverages this, I have a pretty basic relationship here still. So it's just two tables, very simple for the time being. We're going to make this more complex over time. But within inside these two tables, again, we have the login of the user that I'm trying to pull in. So I have user principal name is the name of the column that I've created here. And that's going to be the login that we're going to tap into and tie in with Power BI. All right, so if we were to set this up, we would, again, go underneath the modeling ribbon and inside the manage role area, you're going to go into the manage role area and we're going to set up a new role, and we'll call this role dynamic security. And we're going to secure based on the column that has in it that email address. So within inside of the hospital general information, I can tell it that I want to add a filter, and I want to add the filter on the doctor's email. And so it's just a simple little plugin here, but rather than us just using this, and rather than us just passing in a value, a hard-coded value like we did in the first example, we're instead going to pass in a function called user principal name. So if we, and you know what, just to make sure I don't type or misspell anything, because that would wreck our demo here, I'm going to copy and paste the code over here, just to make sure I get it in here correctly. But using that user principal name function, that will allow us to tap into whoever logs into my Power BI report, capture what login they have, and cross-check it against the table that I have, and verify that the person that's logged in is allowed to see the certain rows that exist inside of my data model. Okay? This is a super basic example. I'm going to show you a more complex example in a little bit that's going to perform a little better, but let's show you the first example here before we go into that. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is whenever you're using this within inside of the Power BI desktop, it may or may not be easy to test. And the reason why I say that is when you're using the username function or even the user principal name function, oftentimes it won't return back the same account that you would have in Power BI. What I mean by that is if I go to page 2 here, and you can take a look here, this is what the username function's returning back for me, as well as the user principal name function are returning back my machine name. The machine name that I happen to be logged in right now is called Devin Knight, and then my Windows account is being returned back for the username. So that's my login to my Windows account. It's not necessarily the login that I would have whenever we're inside Power BI. So the username function or even the user principal name function may give a different appearance when you're in the Power BI desktop than they will when you're inside of the Power BI service. So just because it may appear that just because it doesn't appear to work inside the Power BI desktop does not mean it won't be working whenever you go to deploy to the Power BI service. So the Power BI service is really where you can test and verify that this is working properly. Now there's one other element that we need to do, but let's first go ahead and deploy this off to the Power BI service. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this off, our second example. And we'll go ahead and select our same workspace we deployed to just a few moments ago. Okay. And so once I deploy this off to the Power BI service, we'll then go find it, and it should be appearing here already. Just verify that's the correct one. It looks like it is. And so inside this data set, if we want to assign a security set of users to the security role that we created, we would do the same thing we did earlier. So we would go to the data set, we would hit the ellipsis here and select security. By the way, you can also do this on the left-hand side. If your preference is to go over here, if you like the navigation on the left-hand side, you can do that as well. You would simply come over here to the example that I've deployed, and I would select security. And then again here, I would assign the users to my security role. So if it's individual users, great. You can type in individual users if you wanted to, or if you wanted to type in your entire group, you can do that as well. So I have a group called trainers. I'll go ahead and type in trainers, hit add and save that. And then once that's saved, we can test out this role by hitting the ellipses here and hitting test as role. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier that about the Power BI desktop is, remember when we were in the Power BI desktop, this same function, the username function, showed my machine name with my Windows user account. But when I'm on the Power BI service, it actually shows my email account. So that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you're testing out the security. Like I mentioned, you may not necessarily get it to work in the Power BI desktop like you think. You might actually need to go to deploy to the Power BI service to get the interaction that you're expecting. All right, so with this deployed to the Power BI service, you should see, if you happen to remember, that I'm seeing a map now that has much fewer states actually listed, because it's actually picking up the login that I have with inside of the Power BI service now, which is my dknight@pragmaticworks.com, and it's cross-checking that against my users that I have inside my table, and it's only bringing back the states that apply to me. I could test this with other users as well. So if I go up to the top here, I can tell it that I want to actually try this as a different user. So if I want to try this as, let's say, Erin Ostrowski, I can type in her user account here and hit apply. And we should see whenever I switch to a different user and test as a different user that I get a different result. And so Erin has, it looks like, results in Oregon and Texas, Oklahoma. Oh, no, not quite Oklahoma, but she's got a few around. No, it is Oklahoma. So she's got a fewer set of states, or if I wanted to, I could test it out as somebody else, let's say as Daniel this time. And I can see Daniel has a different set of states applied to him. So it looks like my security model is working. The one downside of the way that I have this set up right now is the difficulty is that it's only one per hospital. I don't necessarily have multiple users per hospital, but that's a pretty common scenario, right? It's very common that you may actually want to have multiple users be able to see the same rows. And so how would you do that? So that's our next setup that we want to talk about here. So this next setup that we're going to talk about is getting a little bit more complex, but and a little bit more of a complex data model in this case, but it's still the same principle of what we've talked about here. The difference here now is we're going to add in a few extra tables. So I've split out users into their own table. I have states, or you can say this is hospitals over here. So let's just first focus on these two tables. I have a user table and I have a state table. And what I'd like to do is I want to restrict which users can see data from specific states. Now, I might have some users that can see data from the same states. So there may be, for example, it looks like in this case that Devin and Mitchell can both see the state of Georgia. In fact, let me bring this in to make this a little easier to see. So I've kind of gotten rid of the key values there, but it looks like Devin and Mitchell should be sharing the state of Georgia. They should both be able to see that same information. And so the way that you kind of manage something like this is you'll often bring in and create a bridge table. And this is done through a many-to-many relationship where I have a many-to-many between the user table and the state table, where I could potentially have one user appear multiple times for various states, and I could have a state be assigned to multiple states be assigned to multiple users. So it becomes kind of a little bit of a more complex design, but this is what you would do whenever you have a use case where you need a user to see multiple values and a set of users share a single value in some cases. Now, this is all relating back to the sales table, or in this case, my sales table, but this could be whatever metric it is that you're trying to analyze in this case. So for this example, what we would need to do, and I have a second example I'm going to open up for this, a second model. Let me go ahead and close this one out. But in this scenario, I'm going to show you what my model looks like first. It's still the same data set. We're still looking at Medicare spending data, but I want to walk you through in this scenario what the data model actually looks like before we go too deep, because that's really the more difficult part here. Is you're going to have to do a little bit of extra legwork on the data modeling side to be able to get this to be set up and work. This is a very similar example to what I had in the slides just a few moments ago. I have a user table. So I have a list of all my users here. And then I have my hospital table that I want to restrict the rows on. So I've done this a little bit differently. In the previous example, I had a column in here that actually had in it the users. So I had a column in here that had the doctor's user account that I wanted to restrict. I still have something like that in here, but this is actually just capturing the currently logged in user. I don't have a doctor email account in here that I'm monitoring anymore. Because what I'd like to do instead is I want to have the ability where multiple users could be tied into the same provider, the same hospital. And so because of that, I have a bridge table that's been defined here. And what that bridge table is really just a combination of all of the different scenarios, and some people call it a scenario table, some people call it a profile table, but I have called it a bridge table here because it's a bridge between my provider or my hospital and my users. So which users are allowed to see which hospitals is defined within inside of this bridge table. And if you want to see what it looks like, it's really just a table that has a bunch of keys in it. So I have the list of the provider IDs and a list of the user IDs, and you'll see that in some cases a user might have access to a ton of different hospitals, or I might have one hospital appearing here multiple times where multiple users are assigned to the single hospital. Now, the setup for this is a little bit different. The first thing that we would do is we would go into our manage roles section here. And inside the manage role section, you can see I've already defined a security role, and it's already using the same ID of how we did this before, where we had the username. The only difference here is rather than tapping into the hospital table like we did previously, I actually have the security tied into the user table. And so inside the user table, I've selected and told it that I wanted a filter to look at the user principal name and only filter on the username that's logged in to be matched up with the user principal name function, the DAX function, that captures whoever's logged in. Now, this part's exactly the same as what we did in the previous example. That's why I had it already pre-configured here. But there is one extra step that you need to do inside your data model to make sure this is going to work correctly. So let me show you how this works. The last thing that you would need to do is inside your data model itself, you have to consider how things are related inside of your data model to ensure this is going to work. Because right now, if I were to go deploy this to the Power BI service and test this out, it wouldn't work, but I want to explain why. Let me go back to the slides just for a moment to explain the why this wouldn't work. So if I were to attempt to use this right now, the model itself and the tables behind it are fine. It's more an issue with the relationships, because if you remember what we did with inside of my role is we set up a security on the username function, and we told it to match up to the user principal name. So whenever someone comes to log in, verify that they are inside of my user table. Now what happens behind the scenes is it applies a filter across my entire model, or it attempts to at least, and it applies that filter to work based on the relationships you have in your model. And the reason why it's not going to work properly is because of the way my relationships are defined right now. Right now, I have single relationships. These little arrows that you see right now are pointing in the direction where filters can be applied. And so I can filter from my user table. I can filter my bridge table, but I don't have a filter that's going the direction of my hospital table, so it's never going to make it past this zone right here, so past this relationship. So there's a couple ways you can fix this. One way is you can actually change the relationship type to a more of a bi-directional deployment, or both cross-directional deployment, which has some benefits and disadvantages. So if you've played around with some of these security models before, there's definitely some disadvantages from a performance standpoint, but it would allow my security model to work. So let's walk through that, and then I'm going to show you the alternative that actually performs better after that. All right, so the change that I would need to make inside of my relationship view here is on this relationship. So again, the problem here is follow the arrows. And right now, the way I have this set up is the security is set up on the username function right here. And because of the way that the relationships are set up, it's going to push that filter into the user bridge table, but the user bridge table isn't allowing any filters to go past it. So to modify the relationship, you would go into the relationship here, just double click on it or right click and select edit. And then you'll see there's a cross filter direction option here that you can change, and you can make it a both direction filter option. And you not only need to turn this on, but you also need to select this option here where it says apply security filter in both directions, which means it can pass my security over into the other part of the model as well. So I would check that on. Then I'd hit OK. Now, when you do that, you'll notice that it does change the way your relationship looks. This is what a relationship setup as both looks like. And again, if you follow the logic that I showed you earlier, if you follow those arrows, it would now allow my filter to pass from my user table all the way over to my hospital table like I need it to. Okay? So with that turned on, let's redeploy, or let's deploy this example. I'll save it and publish this. And then I got a couple more examples here with the last few minutes that we have. Ones that are even more complex, and ones that deal with some of the performance problems that happen here. Because one of the downsides of this example that I'm showing you right now is while it does work and it allows me to make this much more dynamic where I could have multiple users assigned to a single hospital, the downside is you may experience some performance problems with it. And it tends to come down to that relationship type that we just set up. This relationship type, while it is super effective, it can hurt performance significantly in some cases. I have a pretty small model here, so we're not going to see a drastic performance difference here. But just note when we're dealing with larger models that could be a problem. So if I go back over to Power BI, and we're going to look at my new model that we just deployed. So I should have one here called number 3, many-to-many dynamic example. I'm going to go ahead and set up my security on this like we did our previous examples. So I'm going to set up my user group, my AD group called trainers, and hit apply and save. And then with that saved, I'm going to test out the security role. Because what it'll allow me to do, and what we should see, is that I should now have multiple users assigned to the same states. In the last example we looked at, we would not have multiple users assigned to the same state. But in this case, I should see that different in this case, where I actually have more than one user assigned to the same state here. So to test that out, currently we're looking at as if I were logged in. You can verify that because you can see this is my login right here, and this is the rows that I'm allowed to see whenever I'm logged in. So let's see, though, if I were to switch to a different user, if any of those same states pop up again. So if I were to go up here, and let's say this time I want to test this as my colleague here, Mitchell, and hit apply. Let's see if Mitchell has access to any of the same states as me. And it looks like he had access to a few of the same ones, but he's got some other ones as well. So a few of the ones I have, he also has, and then he's got some new ones on the West Coast. But I can also test this as, let's try Manuel. So if I test this as Manuel and hit apply, we'll see that some of us have some of the same states here again. So Manuel has access to a lot of the states, including some of the ones that I had access to and some of the ones that Mitchell had access to. So again, this gives me the ability now with this many-to-many relationship design, it gives me the ability to now have one user assigned to multiple hospitals or multiple users assigned to the same hospital. All right, now, again, I mentioned there's performance problems with this setup. So how do you solve the performance problems? Well, there's an alternative way of solving it, which requires you to write a little bit more DAX than just what we've done so far. So again, using the both option that we found underneath the cross filter direction can hurt performance. And so what we can do instead is we can actually use this filter function within inside filter, or in this case, I'm using the lookup value DAX function within inside of my security model you see in the screenshot here. But it's going to do a quick lookup and verify, do rows exist in that bridge table between these two security tables that I have, or the security table I have, the user table, and the user bridge function. So this is really the better option. You don't have to modify a bunch of your relationships like we did in the first example, and it's going to perform faster when you're dealing with larger sets of data. Okay, so I'm going to open up my fourth example here, and I'm glancing over at questions here as we go. I see a question here, can you implement row-level security on on-premise servers? So if you're using the Power BI report server, you most certainly can do that as well. Another question here, is the session recorded? It absolutely is. That's usually up by the end of the week. We'll put it on our YouTube channel as well. If you haven't looked at our YouTube channel before, we have a ton of recorded webinars on there that you can find. So it's just Pragmatic Works when you go onto YouTube. All right, so let me show you this actually this is not quite our final example, but our next example. In this example, this goes back to the same data model we had before, but you'll notice I'm not using the both directional cross-filter relationship that we saw in the previous example. That's what made our security model work in the last example, but we noted that whenever we switch this to both, it does cause performance problems. So if I switch this to both, it's going to cause performance problems. So to avoid that, there is something that we can do within inside of DAX to basically go through that relationship without actually having to use it. And there's a couple different ways you can write it, just like any kind of code language. There's several different ways you can accomplish the same thing. You could use a filter function. You could use lookup values. I think there's even another way you can do it. But in my case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the modeling ribbon, and we're going to launch the roles. And we're going to create another new role. We'll go ahead and name this dynamic security again. Oop, trying to spell it right here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to apply this on the hospital table rather than the user table. So we're applying the security role at a different level, and then our DAX statement is going to actually help it hop through the relationships that we have. So underneath the hospital general information, we're going to expand this and add a filter, and we're going to add the filter on the provider ID here in this case. And then what we're going to do is we're going to replace this value section here. And within inside of this section, what we're going to do, instead of just typing in and hard coding a value, we're going to use the lookup value function. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do open and close parentheses as we start to work through this. And what I'd like to do is I want to call on a couple of the tables that we have. So I want to bring, and basically what the lookup value function is going to do, if you come from more of a SQL background, this is kind of like the idea of doing a join, where it's going to do a join across multiple tables. But the first thing that you do with a lookup value function is tell it what value you want to return back. And in our case, we want to return back the value that's inside of our bridge table for the provider ID, because we only want to return back the results where the provider ID is in the bridge table for a particular user. So what we're going to do is from the provider user bridge table, and unfortunately there's no IntelliSense in here, so what some people will actually do is they'll write this as a measure inside their Power BI model and then copy and paste out the code, because the IntelliSense will help them write a lot of this. So I could easily make a mistake here. If I do, I'll copy and paste in the code I have on the side here. But we want to go look up and bring back a value from the provider user bridge table, and the value that we want to bring back is the provider ID. Okay, and we're going to bring back that provider ID where the username from our user table matches the user principal name. Okay, so we're going to bring back from, I think I have it called dim user. Yep, you can see it on the left-hand side there. From the dim user table, we're going to bring back the user name column. Okay, and we're going to make sure that matches the user principal name. Okay, now I'm going to add one other kind of secondary join in here to make sure that it brings back the proper value. So the secondary join that I have here is going to be between the user bridge table and the hospital table. So we're going to add that one in here. That's going to be between the bridge table, which I'll just copy and paste here. And then what this one is going to do is it's going to join between that bridge table and the provider table. Okay, so this is going to be the hospital general information, and the provider ID. Okay. So it's not a ton of DAX code. In fact, it looks like more lines of code than it really should be because I was doing some carriage returns in there, so it was a little easier to see. But that little bit of code in here will perform a lot better than the first example that I showed. The first example I showed, again, just as a reminder, is I applied the security on the dim user table, and all I told it to do was match up from the dim user table, use the user principal name, and then we had to go change the relationships. The problem with that is the change in that relationships really hurts the performance of the table, and the model, I should say. So what I'm going to do instead is use a little bit of DAX, and just to make certain that I have typed all that right, is I'm going to bring in the code I've already have written here, and then I'm going to hit save. It's the exact same thing. I just wanted to make sure I have it in here correctly. And I'm going to go ahead and save that, and then we're going to deploy this model out without changing anything in my relationships. So I'm going to keep the relationships as is because I know that's the point of contention with my performance. So I'm now going to go ahead and deploy this back out to the Power BI service. Go ahead and save it locally. And one thing that you should note is, again, this is a smaller data set, so you're not going to notice the performance difference as much, but you will notice it's pretty peppy with how quickly it returns back the results, even with this newly defined security setup. All right, so while that's redeploying, let me go back over to my Power BI service. And I'm going to go to my data set, so number 4 here, DAX Dynamic Security. And we're going to go to the security, and we're going to assign a group to this again. Again, you could do groups, users, whatever you prefer, and hit apply. I definitely recommend doing groups. And then we're going to test this rollout as well. Alrighty, and so this is what I'm seeing as my currently logged in user, which you can see I'm currently logged in as D Knight. But if I were to switch users to someone else, let's say, for example, I switch this time to Mitchell and hit apply, you'll see the security role will change, and I see different amounts of states appear. There we go. And I can see, by the way, if I go to flip over to page 2 here, you can see it thinks I'm logged in as Mitchell right now as well. So I'm able to test as him and verify that I'm seeing different results. And if you're dealing with larger models, this will perform a lot better. So yes, this is, I see another question here. It's absolutely recorded, and you can capture that DAX code that I did again. By all means, you can capture that. I'll have that available with inside of the video that we're going to post. So real quick, the difference was here, in this example, was in our role that we created. We had about 4 lines of code, maybe 4, where we actually told it that we wanted to use this lookup value function. And I saw some questions earlier about, how would you set this up in analysis services like SSIS Tabular? You would do the exact same thing. So if you wanted to do row level security in analysis services Tabular, it works the exact same way. So you would set up the same model using that many-to-many relationship, and then you would use this DAX function like I've shown here as well. Okay. I do see a question that's popped in from Kathy about if you're using embedded. So there is some things to consider if you're using Power BI embedded, and I'm sorry if this is not directly answering your question, Kathy, but I think it is. If you're using Power BI embedded, you're still likely going to have a username that you're capturing when that someone logs into your application with. And so the big difference that you'll do if you're using Power BI embedded is you actually won't use the user principal name function. You'll just use the username function instead. So if I was using Power BI embedded and I wanted to capture the login from my application and verify it against my model, you would do username instead of user principal name. Okay? All right, cool. All right, so the last example that I have, a little bit more complex. We're taking it up another notch here with the last few minutes that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that while I bring the slides back up here for a moment. Okay, so this last example that we're going to look at is a different scenario, but the scenario we're looking at in this example is having a parent-child hierarchy, or some people refer to it as a self-referencing hierarchy. But basically what this is where I have a reporting structure or a organizational hierarchy within inside of my table where individuals report to each other. So you can see the difference in this example is I have a manager ID column on the far right, and I have a user ID column on the far left. Well, anytime you see a manager ID of 2 in this scenario, those are people that report to Manuel. So I can see Mitchell has a manager ID of 2. He reports to Manuel. Daniel has a manager ID of 2. He reports to Manuel. Aaron has a manager ID of 3. She reports to Mitchell. Devin does not have a manager ID. He doesn't report to anybody. He's the top of the hierarchy. And so what you do in this scenario is you would have to do things a little bit differently. And essentially what you would do in Power BI is you use a DAX function called path. And what the path function allows you to do is lay out what this hierarchy would look like in multiple columns, because Power BI doesn't really necessarily support like self-referencing relationship, meaning a table that has a relationship back to itself. So what you have to do instead is you actually have to lay out each one of these columns inside of your data model so that you can actually see how the relationship lays out in individual columns rather than just referencing back to itself. And then what we're going to do next is inside of our security model, we're going to use an OR function to be able to say, is it part of this level of the hierarchy? Is it part of this level of the hierarchy? Because Devin, who is at the top of the hierarchy, he should see everyone's results. Manuel, who's pretty high up in the hierarchy, should see the bottom 3 people's results. And then Aaron should only see her results, but she can also, but Mitchell can see his own and Aaron's. So let's walk through this example. It's a little bit different, but it's an interesting one. So again, here's what my data looks like right here. So here's my model. And actually, I've changed it up a little bit. Now Manuel is the top of my hierarchy, so I changed it up a little bit for this example. But what I would need to do is I would need to write a few DAX functions to kind of lay things out. And we're going to start with a function called path. And what the path function allows you to do is basically get the ordinal breakdown of how all of these values should be laid out. So to do this, we're going to create a new column, a new calculated column in DAX. And what this column is going to do is it's going to return back. And because we're running short on time here, I'm going to copy and paste in some code. But what this is going to do is it's going to return back the org hierarchy of how things should be laid out. And so it's going to create a new column here that kind of identifies the hierarchy. So who reports to who in the hierarchy is displayed here. Okay. So then what you can do with this, and this is a pretty common function. If you ever have a self-referencing relationship, this is a common use case of how do you actually deal with it, is you start by laying out the path, and then you start to create additional columns for each of the levels of your hierarchy. So here I can see that I have 4 levels of my hierarchy because it's broken up by these little pipes. And I can see I have 4 different levels. So what I would do next is I would have to create 4 columns here that returns back the email address for each level of the hierarchy. So I would do another new column here. And I would say that this is going to be my, and forgive me, I'm going to do some copy and pasting here because we're running short on time a bit. I would say this would be my org hierarchy level 4. Here we go. So Daniel's, in this case, is the lowest level of my hierarchy. I'm going to copy and paste this. I'm going to create another new column. And this will be org level 3. And the reason why we're doing this, again, is we're trying to return back who reports to who and also who should be able to see each other's data. Because the manager should be able to see the subordinates' data here in this case. So we're going to build out this little hierarchy. And again, you can watch the video later to capture the code if you are really looking for that. Okay, and then I'm going to do one more level, which is the top level. Okay, like so. All right, so Manuel is at the top. Then I can see kind of how it breaks down from there. So where does my level of my hierarchy go after there is what you're seeing here. All right, so now let's go. Oh, I hit refresh. Didn't mean to do that. So our next step, while that refresh is occurring, my next step is that I want to now go into the security section, and we're going to apply something similar to what we did in our example 2 times ago, where we had a pretty basic, just return back the user principal name. We're going to keep this one kind of basic. You can definitely make it more complex if you wanted to here if you need, if you'd like. All right, so I'm going to go into modeling and select manage roles again. And this role that we're going to create, we'll call this dynamic security again. And you could name it something like dynamic hierarchy security. But what we're going to do is we're going to place within inside of back over to our user table. We're going to select the username. Yep. And for our username function, we're basically going to check and validate is the username captured here within inside of the hierarchy. And so I have a function that I've already kind of written for this. It's basically a bunch of checks against the different columns that we have. So we're going to check the username column to see if the user principal name matches the just individual that happens to be logged in. So this would be at the level of the individual user. And then I'm going to check every other level of the hierarchy to see if the user logged in should have access to additional data if they happen to be the manager of somebody else. So if I hit save on that and publish this back out, we'll take a look at how this one would work now. So let's go back down to security webinar. And as that deploys out, I'll go back over to it in my workspace. There it is. I'm going to assign an AD group to this. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this, I did see a few questions about the AD group stuff here. In theory, you could put everybody here. So if you have like an all group or something like that, because you want everyone to be checked against your security table to validate if someone logs in, do they exist within inside your security table? Just because you plug them in here does not necessarily mean that you're assigning Power BI licenses to them or anything like that. But they do need a Power BI license to be able to utilize the security that you have set up here. All right, so we've assigned our trainer's role to this again. I can go test as this role. And this is what it's going to look like with me logged in. So with Devin logged in, here's what I see. I could switch this to Manuel. Let's see what Manuel is allowed to see. Manuel should be able to, if I believe, see just about everyone's data. There we go. Yep, he sees everything. So Manuel sees everything within inside of my model because he's the highest level of my hierarchy. Or if I go to one of my lower folks on the hierarchy, let's see, I think Dan was on one of the lower ends. And if I hit apply, we can see only the states that Dan's allowed to see. So the nice thing is the way that this one would work is if you have this kind of self-referencing hierarchy, and I see a question in there, is this similar to the hierarchy ID? Kind of similar. Yeah, it's kind of similar to the hierarchy ID that you have in T-SQL or in SQL Server, where it allows you to kind of navigate through this self-referencing relationship within inside of your model. But this is allowing me to kind of navigate through. I know Manuel is the manager of everyone, so he should see everyone's results. And if I select him, indeed he does. He's going to see the entire United States. Or if I go to one of his subordinates, which I think even would be me in this case, let's see what I had in my model. So let's see, who does Devin report to? Devin reports to Manuel. So if I go to log in as myself, I should see fewer results, but Manuel can see not only mine, but any other of his other subordinates in here.